Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah, daf mem aleph. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Noah ben Shoshan and Ariel Katuf's marriage. Mazal tov. Lag ba'omer sameach. Reminders to register for Siyumim. Again, the main Siyum being on Wednesday, the 17th week. And we're looking forward to seeing you all there. We have a great program with Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz and with Judy Felber's Siyum Hashas. Very exciting. And if you haven't caught, just remind you again, the podcast. So I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from it. Thank you, everybody, for the positive feedback. Again, the podcast, if you're looking for it, it's on the Orthodox Conundrum. Find it in any podcast application, just search it. And kind of a lot of different questions I was asked about women's Gemara learning. Okay, we will get started now with beginning of our daf. So I have a study guide for today. It's just the verses in the Torah, and I didn't do the translation into English. It's really just to get a glance, but anyone who wants to look them up easily, you can find them on Safari or online if you want to see the content of the psukim. We're going to, basically, what we're talking about today, we're going to finish up the section on the kohen gadol and what he reads on Yom Kippur. Then we're going to move to the section of hakhel, which is when the king reads sections from the Torah. We're going to see there's a whole bunch of things that are very parallel. And basically what I brought on the sheet was a little bit the psukim about hakhel, but more is really just what sections of the Torah does the king read during hakhel. I didn't bring all of them, but I brought most of them just so you could get a glance. And that's really what the study guide has today. We're going to start from line 2 of Daf Mem Aleph. V'korei acharei mot v'ach be'esor. So if you remember, he reads the 2 different sections in Vayikra, one discussing the avoda, what they did in the temple on that day, and the second just a general, some rules about Yom Kippur. Now the Gemara is going to bring contradiction. And you might remember, this is fun because you start to get to sugyot that we've seen before. We saw it in Yoma, and we also saw it in Megillah. So it might start to sound familiar. If not, it's okay, don't worry. And if you're new, then don't expect it to be familiar. Midalgim b'navi ve'em midalgim b'Torah. You can skip sections in the prophets, but you can't skip sections in the Torah. What this means is you might have noticed sometimes you have a haftorah where it's got a whole section from somewhere, and then it's got a section from somewhere else entirely, right? And it skips a whole bunch of chapters. It skips books even, okay? Mostly, we'll talk about this soon, within Shreasar, within the 12 books. Usually you wouldn't skip from Yeshayahu to Yirmiyahu. That doesn't usually happen, and we'll see why. But you can skip, when it comes to sections, you can skip in the Navi, but you can't skip in the Torah. Abaye. So now we have a big question, because didn't we skip from Acharei Mot to Abaye? So how can you skip from one to the other? Abaye lo kasha. Don't worry, this is not difficult. Kam b'chdei sheyifsok haTorgaman, kam b'chdei shelo yifsok haTorgaman. We talked about this yesterday, even though the Gemara didn't say it yet, but if you have enough time to get from one section to the other, while the person who's translating basically can translate the pasuk, and you have enough time to get there, meaning it's not so far off, like between these 2 sections in Vayikra, you can do it. Okay, that's the basic answer. If you can't get there, then no, which explains very easily why you can't skip to Bamidbar. We talked about it, and we'll get back to that soon. But the Gemara doesn't like this answer because they say, but wait, if you look there in Megillah where it comes up, ha katane, there it says, there's a braita on that where it says, midalgim midavi ve'em midalgim b'Torah. Okay, so you can skip, this is just the beginning of it that we already saw. You can skip in the books of the prophets. You can't skip in the Torah. Va'ad kama midalgim, but how far can you skip? Now, skip where? In the Torah, the Navi. Obviously in the Navi, because it said you can't skip in the Torah. And then it says, well, when you can skip, which is in the prophets, how much can you skip? Just until the Torgaman is finished. Once the Torgaman is finished, you can't. That's in the prophets. So in the Torah, it sounds like from here you can infer the b'Torah klal klal lo. Sounds like there's absolutely no skipping in the Torah. So in order to resolve this, because we clearly do skip here in the Mishnah, and there's no ways around it. You can skip in the Torah if you're still within the same basic topic. And since the topic was Yom Kippur and you want to skip from Yom Kippur to Yom Kippur, we can do that. You just can't skip to some entirely unrelated issue. Ba'atanya, and doesn't it say in a braita, and this is what we call a braita lechizuk, we're going to strengthen the answer. We're going to say, oh yeah, and this answer can be found in this braita. Midalgim b'Torah b'inyan echad. You can skip in the Torah if you're in the same topic. Ubanavi b'shnei inyanim. And in the prophets, you can even skip to a different topic. V'kan b'chdei shelo yifsak hatorgaman. But in both, it's only as long as there's enough time to get there in the time that the Torgaman is translating the pasuk. By the way, where do we do this in the Torah reading? Anybody know? A day that we actually skip in Torah reading? When we read on fast days, we read Vayichal Moshe, and when about the Chet HaEgel, and we actually skip a chapter. Okay, it skips an entire chapter, the Torah reading. The only time I think it's done, but it's definitely done there. Could be wrong. That's the only time, but I believe it's the only time. In the Nevi'im, it happens a lot. In not so much, but in the Haftorahs, you will see if you look on the side, it'll skip to another section entirely. Now the Braita continues. Now you can't skip from one book of prophets to another book of prophets. But as I said before, within Shreasar, which are 12 small books of prophets, within those 12 books you can skip. But you can't skip from the end to the beginning. And as you can't make a huge gap, okay, from like one of the later books to one of the earlier books. Now we're continuing on what the kohen does. After he finishes reading the first two sections, he rolls up the Torah and holds it, basically. So kol kach lama, why does he have to hold it? We're worried that people will say, why did he close the Torah? Maybe because the Torah is pasul. Maybe he was missing this section. Maybe that's why he's not reading from the next section. So we don't want people to think that the Sefer Torah is missing that section, which people might suspect. So he keeps it in his hands to show this is not a disqualified Sefer Torah. So now we get to the next section in the Mishnah, which is then he basically recites by heart the section in Bamidbar, which has the korbanot, the sacrifices of the day. To which the Gemara asks a seemingly very strange question. Why don't we roll the book and read it? Now, what do you mean? We've just spent all these sections explaining why we don't roll the book, because it's too far, right? We already said that. So everyone struggles with, everyone asks the question here, what is the question of the Gemara? So I'll give you two possible answers. Tosfot Yeshanim says that what the question really here is, before all this, like what's really the issue with skipping? And let's get down to the root of what's the problem there. That's one answer. Another possible answer is to say that maybe the previous Gemara was discussing if the community doesn't know to expect it. And then we're worried that if you skip, you'll kind of lose everybody. People will get distracted. They won't know what's going on. They won't follow where you are and what's happening. And they won't be able to follow the reading maybe because they won't know where you are. But if everybody knows, then perhaps it's okay. And then we have to talk about maybe there's some other issue. In other words, if we're not worried about people being distracted and they won't understand what's flying because maybe this is something everyone knows, then there's still another issue. Okay, so it's a little tricky to understand what this section is coming, like where it's coming from, but we'll go through the content. At least you'll understand the content well, which is, why can't we do this? And the answer is, there's an additional problem. You can't roll a Sefer Torah in public. It's not respectful for the Sefer Torah. Right? You think about it almost like it's like undressing in front of everybody, right? You're kind of rolling it, and it's just not an appropriate thing to do to the Torah in a public forum. Okay, we talked about this yesterday, right? Why don't they just take out 2 Sifrei Torah? That will resolve the problem, right? And we're going to see soon that not only do we do this nowadays in all sorts of situations, they did it then too. So it's not just now. Rav Huna bar Yehuda amar mishum v'gamo shel rishon. We're going to have 2 different answers. One says, because people will think you took out another book because the first one was disqualified and there was something wrong with it. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar, which obviously doesn't resolve our problem when we take out 2 Sifrei Torah, but we'll get there in a minute. Rish Lakish amar, lefi she'em mevarchim bracha she'ena tzricha. The problem is the kohen, gadol is the one reading. In those days, the oleh Torah was the person who also read. Okay, not nowadays. Nowadays we have aliyot and we have the Baal Koreh, the person who reads. But in those days, if you got up, you read from the Torah. That was it. So who's reading from the Torah? Only the kohen gadol. And when you take out the next Torah, he's going to need to say a bracha again because it's a new Torah. And that's going to be an unnecessary bracha because you already made a bracha on the Torah. And you're basically creating the need for a bracha when you don't really need it. And that's why he doesn't take out another sefer Torah. But the Gemara asks, wait, going back to the first reason, we're worried about a pagam. Now, first of all, the second reason isn't relevant nowadays when we take out sefer Torah. Why? Because first of all, the olim read the Torah, make a bracha anyway, and it's new people. But also the new people are reading from the Torah. And it's really that you could have the same person reading, but new people are getting aliyot. So that's not an issue because it's a new aliyah. Our whole Torah reading is different. And also it's new people. In this case, it's the same person. Okay, so now they say, but are we really worried that people are going to think if you take out another Torah that there's something wrong with the Torah? This happened this year. When Rosh Chodesh Tevet falls on Shabbat, you need 3 sefer Torah. Forget about 2. 3. 1 for the Torah reading, 1 for Rosh Chodesh, 1 for Hanukkah. So we're not worried that, everyone's going to think the first one got ruined, right? You've been in shul when this happens. Nobody all of a sudden gets up and says, oh my God, you're taking out another Torah. What's this all about? To which the Gemara answers, Tzlata gavre, but tzlata sifre, lekap gama. Again, the same issue as before. 3 people reading is not going to cause people, it won't cause a bracha shenetzricha, right? Because it's new people. And it also won't cause a concern that there's a pagam because someone else is reading from that Torah. It's clear it wasn't because there was an issue. This is something else going on. But cha gavra betray sifre ikap gama. But if it's the same person reading, and obviously it's the same person reading because the kohen gadol is doing all the reading. Because he's doing all the reading, he can't read from 2 sefer Torah. That doesn't look good. That looks like he's taking out another Torah because it's ruined, right? Because there's something wrong with it. It's very interesting because this all presumes that people don't have any understanding, right? You look in shul and you see them take a 2 sefer Torah, nobody has any thoughts about, nobody worries, maybe there's something wrong. And I don't think it's because you made this distinction in your head, someone else is getting the aliyah for that one and not for that one, right? But in those days, right, they were clearly concerned for this kind of thing, and therefore they'd rather have him read Baal Peh than have people concerned that they start declaring the sefer Torah disqualified. Now we continue on with the Kohen Gadol. We're almost finished. He now makes these 8 brachot. Tanu Rabbanan. We're now going to bring a bright, which has a little bit more detail about the brachot, but not too much. This seems like when you get an aliyah and you say Baruch Hashem noten Torah, right? Either Asher b'charbanu or Asher notah b'tochenu. Anyway, some sort of nusach of brachot Torah. Ala avodah v'ala hoda'ah. Those are 2 blessings from the Shmona Esrei. Right? Ritzei, about bringing back the korbanot, and hoda'ah, thanking. Ve'al mechilat avon, right? In those days, it wasn't bringing back the avodah bracha was obviously different than nowadays. Nowadays, it's right, bring back the rituals that were in the temple. In those days, they were in the temple, but they obviously had a blessing about the work in the temple. Al mechilat avon, which is the bracha we say on Yom Kippur, melech mochel v'soleach la'avonotenu, right? May God absolve us of our sins. So that was 4. Okay, we had ala Torah, avodah, hoda'ah, mechilat avon. Now we have another 4. Ala mikdash b'fnei atzmo. Then there was the special bracha for the temple. Ala kohanim b'fnei atzmam, a special bracha for the kohanim. Al Yisrael b'fnei atzmam, for the Jewish people, and al Yerushalayim b'fnei atzmam. Okay, and on Jerusalem. Now we have to deal with these last words in the Mishnah, which were very unclear. Hash'al tefillah, and the rest is tefillah. We don't know what that means. Tanu Rabbanan, they're going to bring a bright. Hash'al tefillah, tchina, rina, ubakasha. The rest is a tefillah, a supplication, rina, like a praising of God, and a bakasha, and a plea. Sha'amcha Yisrael tzrichin livasher. The Jewish people need to be saved. V'chotem b'shomei tefillah, and finishes the bracha with shomei tefillah. Now we have a big problem. We said he says 8 brachot, and now we have 9, because we had 8, and now we have this one. So there's many different ways to grapple with this. Some people actually don't have Yerushalayim. Some people say Al Yisrael goes together with this Shar Tefillah. Some people say that Shar Tefillah is in addition to the 8 blessings, then he has this general bracha, which is separate. Okay, so there's all different options here, how to understand this. Then what happens after this? You might remember this because this is an interesting thing that happened. After the Kohen finishes reading, Everybody brings a sefer Torah from their house. Interesting to think that people had a sefer Torah in their house. Everybody brings a sefer Torah in their house and reads from it. The kochach lama, in case you're wondering why, the Gemara asks why, or the Braita actually, this is in the Braita. Kedei laharot chazuto l'rabim, to show, sort of to show off, but not in a show-offy way, but to show the beauty of their sefer Torahs in public. Okay, and Rashi says this is part of Ze Eli Vanveu Hitnei Lefanav b'mitzvot. You're supposed to do the mitzvot in a very unique way, in a beautiful way. You're supposed to beautify the mitzvot. So everybody takes out their sefer Torah to show others how beautiful their sefer Torah is. It's interesting. The other issue Rashi brings up is in the previous Rashi, which is, wait a minute, they're all going home now on Yom Kippur and bringing their sefer Torah. Isn't it forbidden to carry on Yom Kippur? So in fact, there's machloket. Is it forbidden to carry on Yom Kippur or not? You can carry on the holidays. You can't carry on Shabbat. Where does Yom Kippur fall, right? Yom Kippur is called the Shabbat Shabbaton. Usually we treat it like Shabbat. Well, there is an opinion that Ein Eruv V'Hotzah Yom Kippurim. So option one is that this source holds that there's no problem of Eruv and carrying. Second option is to say that Jerusalem, because we lock the doors at night, Jerusalem is its own kind of private domain. And therefore you can carry within Jerusalem, which is an interesting idea. Anyway, that's some possibilities that Rashi raises about how could that possibly be. Moving on now to Parashat HaMelech. So now we get to a mitzvah called hakhel, which is they gathered once every 7 years. We'll talk about exactly when. They would gather the people together and the king would get up and read the Torah. Okay, they do this even when there's no king, but when there's a king, the king will read the Torah. Parashat HaMelech Ketzad. So how would this go? Motzei, and again, it has to be done only in Hebrew. Right? This is actually one of the ones that there's no really good source for why it has to be done in Hebrew, but they just seem to assume it has to be done in Hebrew. Motzei Yom Tov HaRishon Shel Chag Bashmini B'Motzei Shvi'it. Okay, so after the first day of Chag is Sukkot, so meaning on the first day of Chol Hamoed, okay, after the first Yantif, Bashmini on the 8th, we'll see what the 8th what is. B'Motzei Shvi'it, after the Shmita year, Osim lo bima shel eitz ba'azara v'hu yoshev aleha. They make him a big bima of wood in the azara, and he sits on it. The king. Shenemar miket sheva shanim. Now I'll read you the pasuk. At the end of 7 years, b'moed shnat shmita in Devarim chapter 31, verse 10. Miket sheva shanim, after the end of 7 years. That's how we know it's the end. B'moed shnat shmita, on the time of, right, the 7 years of the Shemitah. We're going to have to see why they added all these terms, because what, 7 years, wouldn't we think it means Shemitah? B'chag HaSukkot, okay, on the holiday of Sukkot. B'vo kol Yisrael le'ra'ot et pnei Hashem Elokecha, when all the Jews come to the temple to see God. Okay, again, seemingly unnecessary description. We already know they all come on Chag Sukkot, so why are you adding that? We'll see later. Right, in the place that God chooses, Tikrat HaTorah Azot Neged Kol Yisrael B'Oznehem. Read the Torah to all these people, B'Oznehem, let them hear it. So now, what happens in this ceremony? We're now going to see something very familiar. Chazan Knesset, Notel Sefer Torah. So again, the head of the Beit Knesset in Abaye takes the Torah from there. Notna l'Rosh HaKnesset. We're going to have the same procession. He gives it to the head of the Knesset, right? The Beit Knesset. Rosh HaKnesset Notna l'Skan. He gives it to the guy underneath the Kohen Gadol. Haskan notna l'Kohen Gadol. He gives it to the Kohen Gadol. But here we're going to have one last step. Kohen Gadol notna l'Melech. And the Kohen Gadol gives it to the king. The king is the one who's reading here. V'Melech omed u'mekabel v'koreh v'yoshev. The Melech stands, he accepts the Torah, reads sitting. Okay, this is different from before. The Kohen read standing, the Melech sits. We know this because the king generally sits, although we'll see it's not only kings from the house of David, and we're going to have to ask again, how is he sitting? Agripas HaMelech, now we get to Agripas. Okay, I'll talk about him in a minute. Amad v'kibel v'kara omed. He did differently. He got it, okay, stood up like we had before. He accepted it, but he read it standing and not sitting. Mara's going to deal with this soon. Okay, so B'shibchu chachamim, and the rabbi said this was good that you did it standing up. They praised him. Now, while he was reading, one of the sections you're going to see in a minute, he reads is about the king, about appointing a king, and it says you can't put upon you a king who's not Jewish. Zalgoin Avdamaot, he started to cry. Now, why did he start to cry? So first of all, flashback this week of Shuli Mishkan is all about Agripas. You can read it. And there she talks about there's a big debate which Agripas this was. There's two Agripases. One is the grandson of Herod, and one is the son of that Agripas. And Herod was, it's unclear, but the rabbis accused Herod of being from, they assumed Herod was from his father, they said was an Eved Kanani. So if he's descended from Herod, that makes him, right? Aristobulus was the son of Herod, and he was the father of Agripas, and that makes him from a family of non-Jews. And that basically, right, so there's a big question here. And also, Shuli talks about the difference between the relationship of Agripas the first and Agripas the second with the Jews, that the first one had a much better relationship, which maybe more proves that this story is the first one, and you'll see why as the story goes on, although there's evidence in both directions. I'm going to leave all that. You can read it in flashback. But anyway, what happens in this story is Agripas starts to cry. Amrulo al titere Agripas. They say, don't worry, Agripas. Achinu ata, achinu ata. You're our brother, you're our brother. And they try to make him feel better about him feeling that maybe he shouldn't be the king. Remember, the Romans appointed these kings. These weren't Jewish appointed kings. And they're not from Malchut Beit David either, obviously, if they come from a family of slaves. But now, off of the Agrippa story, we'll get back to it in the Gemara. V'koreh mitchilat ela hadvarim ad shma. This is the part I didn't put on the sheet. But they start from the beginning of Sefer Devarim, and they read all the way through until they get to Shema, which is in chapter 6. So they read chapter 1 through 6, Ushma, then they read the paragraph of Shema. Then they skip the whole next section, which goes till chapter 11, where in chapter 11 is Vahayim Shema. The second paragraph of Shema appears there. So they skip all of that and they go to Vahayim Shema. I figured those sections, or at least you got this idea of first to sixth chapter. I didn't put all that on the sheet. You can look at it. And then from there, they skip to 11, where Vayam Shema comes up. From there, they skip to Aser, the mitzvah of Maaser, which is in Devarim Yodalad. You can now look at your sheet. All these things are on the sheet. Then in Psukim Kaf Bet to Kaf Zayin, 22 to 27 in chapter 14. Then they skip to, I just want you to kind of get the sense of the skipping here. So we went from 1 through 6 to 11 to 14. Now we get to Biur Ma'asrot, which is all the way in 26 in Devarim. Okay, everything is in Devarim. Okay, and we go to 26, verses 12 to 15. Uparashat HaMelech, then they jump backwards. A little strange order. They go back, especially in terms of what we just talked about, but nothing's terribly far. Devarim Yud Zayin, verses 14. And there's a bunch of verses about the appointment of a king. And then they skip to the end to the brachot in Klalot, okay, in Kaf Zayin and Kaf Chet, okay, presumably the part about the brachot of the Leviim when they stood in the stones and all that we discussed, and then the whole section that really details the blessings and the curses. Ad shegomer kol parasha, until they finish that whole section of the brachot in Klalot. So first of all, it's a lot. Right? They read a lot of parshiot, and there's a lot of jumping back and forth even. Those 8 blessings that we saw, the king also says, that the Kohen Gadol did. Obviously, instead of saying Melech mochel avonotenu, God pardons our sins, it's more the content of the blessing, Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim, right? That God blesses, right? That the Jewish people and God, God blesses the Jewish people and the times, right? That we bless the time. Okay. Now the Gemara starts off with a question on the Mishnah. Bashmini, I specifically didn't really explain this. On the 8th. On the 8th, what? Sounds like on the 8th day of Sukkot, but it can't be on the 8th day of Sukkot because we just said it's on Motzei Yom Tov Harishon, first day of Chol Hamoed. So Bashmini Sakadata, how could it be on the 8th? We just said it's on Motzei Yom Tov Harishon. Ema Bashminit. It means, no, it's the grammar's off. Bashmini would be the day, right? The 8th day, because it's masculine. Bashminit is on the 8th year. Shana Shminit, on the 8th year. Now, why do we need this whole description in both in the Mishnah, really, and in the Psukim? Mikek Sheva Shanim, as I read the Pasuk, I kind of told you, right? Bimoed Shnata Shmita. First of all, after 7 years, isn't that Shnata Shmita, right? After the Shmita year, seems kind of redundant. Why do you need B'chag Sukkot? I mean, obviously you need it, but we're going to see why you need to say that. Why do you need to say B'vol Kol Yisrael? So they're going to explain these Psukim. Miketz, if you just said at the end of 7 years, you would have thought maybe they start counting 7 years from when Moshe commanded them. That would be immediately. It would have nothing to do with the Shnata Shmita. right? It would just be every 7 years starting from now. Right? And even though we haven't started counting shmita years, obviously we weren't counting shmita years, we were in the desert, we hadn't conquered, right? First you have to get into the land, you have to conquer the land. There's the 14 years they conquered. Only after that did they start counting shmita cycles. So katav rachmana shmita, so that you knew, no, we're talking about 7 years from the shmita cycle. So they didn't do hakhel, presumably in the beginning there, they only did it after the first shmita cycle. The katav rachmana shmita, havamina b'self shmita. If it just said mikesh shavashanim b'moed shnat shmita, you would have thought on the shmita year at the end of it. Katav rachmana b'moed. That's why they said no on the holiday. Now there is no holiday at the very end of the year. The katav rachmana b'moed. But let's say, okay, you say right when the shmita year is over at the holiday. What holiday would you say? Because no, they're working on the pasuk. The pasuk says b'moed shnat shmita. So b'moed sounds like holiday. So then you think the first holiday, Rosh Hashanah, right? Havamina me'reish shata. You would have thought maybe from Rosh Hashanah. Katav rachmana b'chag Sukkot. That's why I had to tell you, no, not Rosh Hashanah. Wait till Chag Sukkot. You might have thought if it just said Chag Sukkot, you could have said we could push it off to the end of the holiday. Then it says when everybody comes. What does that help you with? Now we're already moving to Amud Bet. At the beginning of the holidays, when everybody's there, what happens is people all come to bring their sacrifice, and then slowly some people start going home already. So the time when you have the most people there is when you do this, and that's going to be at the end of the first Chag when everybody is there. Now the Rosh HaKnesset. Now we're going to have the exact same sugyot that we had yesterday. It's going to be easy. Since they're doing this procession and everybody gets to hold the Torah, even though someone more important than them is there. Shma mina, we learn from here that a student can get respect even if the Rav is in the room. I'm Abaye, no. This is all to show the whole hierarchy and that the melech is really on top of this one, who's on top of that one, who's on top of that one, who's on top of that one. And that's why it's done. And it's not to show that you can give students respect even when their teacher is around. Second issue that we saw already yesterday. First, they're just quoting the Mishnah. We could have stopped here, but they're quoting the next line as well. But here it already said, the king stands, accepts the Torah, and then reads sitting down. And Agripas HaMelech stood up, took the Torah, read, and was standing. Okay? But the first line is what's important to us right now, and then we'll get back to Agripas. Omed michlal yoshev. If they stand up, the king, it sounds like they were sitting before that. Isn't it only kings from the house of David? Now remember, in the second temple period, the kings were being appointed by the Romans. They were in charge. And they weren't kings only from David. By the way, this section about David coming and sitting is the section, remember, David didn't build the temple, but he did go before Hashem, which probably means in the Mishkan, and it's obviously parallel, but it's in the section right after David says, I want to build palace for God, and I want to build the temple, and God tells him you can't. Right after that comes this section. So they answer, so just like Rav Chisda explained, there it's in the Ezrat Nashim. Also here it's in the Ezrat Nashim, meaning the kohen, the king reads the hakhel ceremony not in the Azara. He reads it in the Ezrat Nashim. And then we don't have that issue because in the Ezrat Nashim, anyone can sit there. Now we get to V'shibchuhu chachamim. Agripas stood up, and the rabbi said, this was great what you did. Shibchuhu michal deshapir abed. It sounds like what he did was good. Hamar Rav Ashi, didn't Rav Ashi say, afilu l'man da'amal nasi shemachalak kvodo kvodo machul, melech shemachalak kvodo en kvodo machul. There's a lot of sugyot that grapple with people who are deserving of a certain amount of respect. Are they allowed to say, I don't care? Like parents, right? We have respect for your parents. You're not supposed to sit in your parents' seat. But if your parent says you can sit in my seat, it's okay. So a nasi, who's a leader, actually can be mochel on their kavod. They could say, I relinquish my respect. I don't need it. But a king is not allowed to do that. Why is a king not allowed to do that? Shnei mal. Going back to that section about the king, what does it say? Som tasim alecha melech, put a king upon you. Shetehe emato alecha. What does it mean, som tasim? That his fear should be on the people. You need to create, this is what they call in the army, distance, which is all about making sure that there's a clear hierarchy in place and everybody knows they're in fear of the king. They don't live in fear of the king. It creates all sorts of problems in the system. So how could the king can't relinquish his desire, right? If he wants to say, I don't really care, it's not allowed to do that. So how could Agripas have stood and how could the rabbi say this was good? Mitzvah shana. This was different because this was out of respect for the Torah. Okay, it wasn't a case where the king was basically saying, oh, I don't care, we can break the distance. But no, he said, I want to show respect for God. And because of that, they allowed it. Now we get to the last section of today's daf and a whole different approach to this whole story of Agripas. Then what happened? He started to cry, and then everybody says, "Achinu ata, achinu ata." You can even a little teaser for Shul Mishkan. You can see who. Okay, trivia question: who in history used that phrase "achinu ata, achinu ata"? And what famous speech? You can look at it. You can look there and figure it out. So now, Tana Mishmei de Rabbanit, B'ota sha'a nitchayvu Yisrael klaya. The Sonei Israel, those who hate the Jews, which actually means the Jewish people. They just don't like to say that the Jewish people were deserving of destruction. But basically, it was deemed that day that they were going to be destroyed. This is, they're about to be destroyed in the destruction of the temple. Right? This is kind of this caused their destruction. Why? Because this was false flattery. This is just pure kissing up to the king. This is really inappropriate what they did. And now we're going to talk about flattery. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, miyom shegavar egrofa shel Hanufa, from the day that the egrof, the fist of Hanufa, of flattery, kind of took over. First of all, notice egrofa Agripas. You notice the literary connection there. Nit of tu hadinim, all the judgments became perverted. Nit kalkalu ma'asim, all actions became confusing, right? No one can any longer say, my actions are better than yours. Why not? Because all the lines between good and bad were blurred. Once people start saying, oh, what you did was great, it was really bad, right? It's none of us like when somebody compliments all the time because it means nothing, right? This is what we're talking about here. At this point, once everybody's saying, oh, that's so great what you did. So you no longer know whose actions are greater than anyone else's because you have no way to compare what's what. And everything got corrupted along the way. So it messes up all sorts of things. It messes up your ability to judge your own actions and compare them to others. It messes up your ability to judge. It messes up all kind of the whole system gets ruined. However, despite that, this is an interesting statement in the middle of all this, although we're going to go right back after to how bad it is to flatter. It's actually permitted to flatter the evil people in this world. How did he learn this? They will no longer call the despicable person a generous person. Ulechilai, another word for a sinner. Lo ye'amel shoah. Shoah is noble. They will no longer call him a noble person. This pasuk is referring to there'll be a time in the future where this will no longer happen, which means that in this world it kind of could happen. That's his drasha, why you would do this, and why after we just said the Jewish people are deserving of death because they did that, and now we say it seems to be okay. So the commentaries all try to grapple with this sentence and how to fit it in with the Gemara. We'll leave it as a question right now. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar Mehacha. He actually learns it, the fact that you can flatter from a different pasuk, that you're allowed to flatter evil people, from Yaakov. Remember the whole thing with Vayishlach, when he goes to meet Esav and he brings him all these gifts, and then he says to him, when I see you, it's kirot pnei Elohim v'tirtzeni. Looking at your face is like seeing the face of God. Come on, that's what Yaakov thought of Esav, right? That's flattery. But pleaded to Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi totally disagrees with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and says that's not flattering of Rishaim, and that proves to you it's okay to flatter evil people. No, that was what you call self-defense, right? What is this like? Someone who invites his friend, and he realizes his friend's going to kill him. Amarlo, so he says the following line. He kind of makes this up, but to save himself. What I'm eating right now, the taste of this, it's just like that dish I had when I was at the king's table. Amal, and the other one who's sitting with him, who wants to kill him, says, Yada le Malka, he knows the king. Mistafei v'lo katile. He gets scared. He's like, this guy knows the king, and I kill him. Maybe the king will kill me, and decides not to kill him. So that's why Yaakov was flattering Esav. He was worried Esav was going to kill him. He had good reason to believe so, and therefore it was self-defense. You can't learn anything from there about it being permitted to flatter evil people. Okay, but back now to things about flattery. We're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 statements about flattery. 4 today and 2 tomorrow. In a second, you're going to see the siman for them. The siman actually comes after the first, but it refers back to the first one and then the other 5. That's how I was able to count very easily. Amar Rabbi Elazar, kol adam sheyesh bo chanufa, anyone who is involved in flattery, mevi af la'olam, he brings anger to the world. Shene'amar v'chanfei lev yasimu af, he quotes pasuk where it says, those who are flatterers in their hearts will cause anger, being anger. Below it, ela she'ein tfilato nishmat, and not only that, but the continuation of that pasuk shows that his prayers won't be answered. Shene'amar lo yishav'u ki asaram. Okay, they will not. Lo yishav'u means their prayers will not be answered. Siman, here's the siman af. That was the first one. Ubal, we're going to go back to fetuses, connecting to the previous one we talked about, where there we saw all the fetuses were singing the praises of God at her, right, at the Kriyat Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, and they were able to see things, see the miracle of God. That's how noticeable it was. Well, we're going to see something similar about them being able to see right through flattery. Gehenom, biyado, nida, gola. Okay, we'll get to Ubar, Gehenom, and biyado today, and nida and gola we'll leave off for tomorrow. Ba'amar Rabbi Elazar, kol adam sheyesh bo chanufa, afilu ubarim shebeme'ei imam mekalelin oto. This is the exact same language we had before. Even the fetuses that are in the wombs of their mothers curse you. Okay, if you deal with flattery, you're going to get cursed even by them, meaning they see right through you, even though, right, they're fetuses, and presumably can't see. And even if they could see, they're inside the fetus and they can't see through, right? But somehow it's kind of a way of saying it's so obvious. Everyone can see right through you. Shnema Omer l'Rasha. Now, where do they get this from? A pasuk? Interesting one. Omer l'Rashat tzadikata. This is flattery. You say to a Rasha, you're a tzaddik. Okay, you're not. Yikavuhu amim, yizamuhu le'umim. Okay, yikavu usually means to curse. Nations will curse you, and yizamuhu, they will get angry at you, le'umim. Other nations will get angry at you. Le'um is also nations. But how are we going to darshan this? So first of all, ein kov elakala. Kov is a curse. How do we know it's a curse? Shenemar lo kabo el. This is in the Bilam story. It's referring to a curse. Ve'ein la'om ela ubarim. Now the word la'om, which means nation, also is a reference to fetuses, where, who remembers, back to Yaakov and Esav again, Shenemar la'omi la'om yamatz. That's the prophecy that Rivka gets about the children in her womb. So la'om is a reference to the ubarim. This is in the world of drasha, obviously. V'amar Rabbi Elazar, kol adam sheyesh bo chanufa nofel begehenom. We're up to number 3. We had af, ubal, now gehenom. So he falls into gehenom. How do we know this? Shenemar hoi ha'omrim lara tov v'latov ra. Right? Woe is to those who say that good is bad and bad is good. Again, that's flattery. Maktiv acharav. What does it say right after that? Lachen ke'echo kash lashon esh v'chashash lahava yirpeh. Right? It will be like the fire eating straw, right? And the fire, what's the fire a reference to? Right? You'll get destroyed by fire. That's usually the fire of Gehenom, of hell. Ba'amar Rabbi Elazar, 4th statement. We'll only get to the beginning of this today. Kol machnif lechavero, sof nofel biyado. If you flatter someone else, in the end, you're going to fall into their hands. They'll destroy you. V'ime no nofel biyado, nofel biyabanav. And if not into their hands, well, their children's hands. Ime no nofel biyabanav. And if not their children, nofel biyabem bino, their grandchildren. Where do we see this? We'll see the very beginning. We'll see the Hanifa part. We won't see the rest of it till tomorrow. Shneimar vayomer Yirmiyahu leChananya. Hananya was a false prophet who said that I think it was in 2 years, he says, after the destruction, he says in 2 years, all the Klei Beit HaMikdash, or maybe it was actually for the destruction. I don't remember exactly when this comes up, but he says all the Klei Beit HaMikdash that were taken away are going to be brought back. Okay? So he says, right. Yeah. No. It's obviously after the destruction. He says, "Lashiv klei beit Hashem v'kol hagolam mi Bavel el hamakom hazeh." Okay, all the people are going to come back, and the klei beit hamikdash are going to come back. I think he said in 2 years. I have to check my details. But anyway, he was a false prophet, obviously, because that didn't happen, right? And we knew that wasn't going to happen. So Yirmiyahu says to Hananiah, instead of saying you're a false prophet and calling it as it is, thank you for checking, Ruth, that yes, it's 2 years. So Yirmiyahu says to Hananiah, Amen, King Ya'aseh Hashem, Yakem Hashem Tvarach. Maybe he was being a little sarcastic, but he says, yes, it should be like you said, meaning I wish it was like you said, right? And it wasn't like Yirmiyahu was really saying the wrong thing, but he should have said it more directly and said, you're a false prophet, instead of saying, Hashem shall fulfill your words that you said. And then he even goes into saying what you said, they're going to return the clay Beit Hashem, and the people are going to return from the exile. And that was considered a form of flattery because he said it in more like God should fulfill your words, saying almost like it was a good thing. So Yirmiyahu was actually accused of, and he was the one who did Hanifah, used flattery, and we'll get to tomorrow the continuation of that story. So we have for today, we started with the continuation of the psukim that the Kohen Gadol reads. How could he skip? We talked about the whole thing about skipping, the difference between the prophets and the Torah. Then we moved to, and then that other book, why we bring another sefer for the sefer Bamidbar, and why he keeps it why he keeps holding it so that people don't, right? There's all this concern, people will think it's disqualified. Then we went to the brachot that he said. We pointed out this issue of there being really 9 and not 8. We mentioned some possible ways of understanding that. Then we moved to hakhel. And we saw that it was very parallel, right? Just instead of the Kohen Gadol, we have the king, who's actually considered on a higher level the Kohen Gadol. So we saw because the Torah moved from the Kohen Gadol to the king. And then we had that story with Agripas when he started crying in the middle, very emotional, right? But then the people said, oh no, all's good, which got us later into this whole thing about flattering, false flattery. And then we talked about all the sections in Devarim that he reads, a little bit jumpy back and forth. And then we also said that he makes the same blessings that the Kohen Gadol does. And then we had a whole description about why the Torah gives all the details, what you might have thought otherwise, that you had to have all these details so that we knew exactly what the day was. And then we went into the same 2 issues as yesterday. Do you learn here, you give respect to the Talmud instead of the Rab? And how did he sit if Malchei Beit David are the only ones who can sit in the Azara? Must have been happening in the Ezrat Nashim, just like the ceremony of the Kohen Gadol. Then, right, this, by the way, shows that it's like as if these sugyot existed independently, because if we knew yesterday, we wouldn't need to ask all these questions again today, right? But sometimes they just ask them in the same way as if kind of haven't seen it before. Then we had a whole thing, how could they think this was a good thing that Agrippa stood up? Isn't a king not allowed to relinquish his desire, the respect for him that he's deserving of? But we said it was for a mitzvah, so it was okay. And then we got into the whole thing about the flattery and had the people flatter him, and actually it was wrong what they did. And then even though we did see the statement that you could flatter Rishaim in this world, all the statements after seem to be saying to flatter is a bad thing. And we have 6 statements about it. 4 we saw already, that it brings anger. Even the Ubarim curse you, even the fetuses curse you. It sends you to Gehenom, you go to hell, and the ado that you get given into the hands of the person that you flattered. We'll see the other 2 need to go out tomorrow, and the continuation of the proof for the biyado one. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everybody a Lag BaOmer Sameach, and have a great day.